I've always had a great interest in ancient Egypt, ancient history, from being a child, because my father, and this is back in Nottingham, my father actually used to tell stories of Robin Hood, King Arthur, and various different mythical people or, mysteries. And from then, basically when I got married and met my wife and moved over to Ireland, and we moved into swords, I was actually interested in the Celtic side of history for Ireland, so started researching a few of these things, and I came across a connection with ancient Egypt, and of course that pricked up my ears, and so all of a sudden I was there. Wow, this is amazing, I've got to look into this, and that's where I started. The lead into the Egyptology part of it was that I was actually invited by somebody I knew who was a publican, Sam Moorhead, very interesting character, and he came from a little village called Clonegall in Wexford. Now, I'd never heard of it, I'd never heard of Huntingdon Castle, and I'd never heard of a lady, Olivia Durden Robertson, and she was the head of the Fellowship of Isis, and he said, could you please come down and meet her one day? So I did. He said that she was a very eccentric woman that didn't suffer fools gladly, so you might only be hello and 5 minutes in there and be shown the door as such. And I went in, and such a fascinating woman I have never met in years, and we hit it off straight away, and we spoke for hours. She made me lunch that went on to tea, and it was 7 o'clock. Lady Olivia, she was very much into the Egyptian end of things, and she sort of spoke a little bit about her interest in ancient Egypt connected to Ireland, and then I mentioned that I'd seen a couple of things basically that linked towards the Tuatha De Danann, who were the original inhabitants of Ireland presumably, and she was fascinated by that and arranged to meet again, and that was the start of where I really got fascinated and interested into and started doing more research on that. When I was researching all this, I first of all started to actually look at the historical aspects and if anything had been done, or was there any actual academic study towards it. And that's where I came across, in the 1950s, Trinity College archaeologist was actually digging on the hill of Tara. He was actually digging a second trench that was on the what's known as the Mound of Hostages. And there they found a small skeleton. And the small skeleton, they thought at first was either a child or a young person, a female, but it wasn't. When an anthropologist looked at it, it was actually a baboon or an African ape. And they were fascinated by this because its depth of where it was out of place. It shouldn't have been that depth, so it was at least hundreds of years old. But when they actually had it carbon dated, they found that it was from around 1350 BC. So that's 1350 years before Christ, which was a fascinating thing. They continued digging, and they actually then came across a skull and a small burial site, and beside that a skeleton that was separate. So the skeleton and skull were separate, but in the grave goods were some gold and some finine beads, which are a ceramic bead that were part of this burial necklace, which again was high technology for that area. And they discovered that when they actually researched or tried to find more about these beads and the gold goods, they sent it to Trinity College for examination, and the chemical structures of these beads were the same, exactly the same, up to 95% of the same as Egyptian beads. So they were actually made in Egypt. And when they actually had a look at the beads and compared them with the burial sites of Tutankhamun, they actually found that they were an identical set, if you will. So they knew that they were actually made in Egypt, they knew they came from Egypt, but again, what were they doing in Ireland in the Tomb of Hostages? And this is where, I suppose, there was more research and fascination about it, because there were already ancient Irish myths about Queen Scotia, who was presumably somebody who came from the West, and she was part of this, I suppose, warrior race that came from the West in magical boats, and they were escaping war and famine. Now, when research was done on Queen Scotia, they noticed that actually her father was called, because it's actually written in the actual stories of this, that she went to Scotland first and then came over to Ireland, and her father was called Aeneas, and Aeneas was actually an Egyptian name for Akhenaten, which is again Tutankhamun's father, and his wife was Nefertari. His sister and first wife of Tutankhamun was Queen Kia, and the other wife was called Menetaten. That's her name. But actually, when Tutankhamun was killed, well, the father Akhenaten died first, and then he took the throne. He died very young, about the age of 18, and Queen Kia and Nefertari took the pharaohship in Egypt. Menetaten had to flee with her people, and she was actually betrothed to somebody from the west. It doesn't state who, but this was a priest. This is in the priesthood records in ancient Egypt. It's in the Egyptian Museum. You can actually see the hieroglyphics of it and a translation. And it said that because she was actually marrying someone from the west, and she was going to a new land, they called her Queen Scotia. So her name was actually Meritaten, and Queen Scotia are the one and the same person. So she went with her people over to Scotland first of all, and that's where the name Scotland gets its name. And also she went to Ireland because she was heading for this new land, or Nova or New Scotia, which again is Canada, Nova Scotia. But she fell foul of something in Ireland where the prince had died. She was with child. She married shortly thereafter one of the High Kings of Ireland, and they were actually fighting with a chieftain from the north, and there was a great battle that took place in Tralee, around Kerry Tralee area, and it is called, the grave of Scotia. She was actually killed, and the child was killed in the battle, and obviously the rest of the Scotia's people fled in their boats to presumably Nova Scotia. But she was actually buried there, and there are rocks and hieroglyphics. There was reputed to be there was a farmer that actually had dug up what was part of a pinnacle, or like an obelisk with hieroglyphics on it, but that's gone missing. Nobody seems to know where that was, and they don't know whether it was fake or fable, but there was a record of it at one stage. And that's where I suppose the most fascinating part is, that you start to get into this thing of, well, why would someone like Queen Scotia, Akhenaten's time, which again, oddly enough, Akhenaten, his reign was around 1850 BC, which is the same time as the prince who died and the same time as Queen Scotia. So you'll find that all links up. But why would she actually come to Scotland and to Ireland? Other than the fact that they knew there was a place there, they knew there was friendly people there. Now, where they got that from was because that same priesthood, which was Methanoran, he wrote that in the kingship, the Tuatha De Danann, or the Tuatha, the people of Toth, were moving westward to a land that was actually of milk and honey, in other words, a vast empire, and they were heading that way. In Ireland, you had the structure of the land of saints and scholars, and the land of saints and scholars was the Christian era. Prior to that, you had the Celtic era, which was, again, it's been loosely connected with the Moors and North Africa. But prior to that, you had myths and legends, and the Tuatha De Danann and the Fomorians were two tribes that actually ruled Ireland. The Fomorians, there's very little information of where they came from, so presumably they were already in Ireland. The Tuatha De Danann came from the west, and they came on magical ships, and they were actually very powerful, not only in architecture, medicines, sciences, mathematics, and stars, reading stars and navigation, but their technology was very high, presumably. And they actually set up with the Fomorians, the north and the south, divided Ireland in two, and they would meet 2 or 3 times a year in the hill of Tara and negotiate any problems or issues, and hence that was where the middle was. So you had Upper Ireland and Lower Ireland, and the middle was Tara. In ancient Egypt, you had Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, and the middle was Memphis, which was the head where everybody used to meet and sort out any problems or issues. So you find that the Tuatha De Danann were there at the very first part of Ireland, ancient Ireland, and therefore they set up the structure of how the Celts would actually move forward and come in. Now, the Fomorians and the Tuatha De Danann did fight at one stage, and it's in the ancient sagas of Ireland, and they said that the Fomorians eventually beat down the Tuatha De Danann, and they actually left in their sailing ships, or their ships that flew, and they went to the west. So it seems that they did go on to Nova Scotia, to America, and inhabited there. When we look at the ancient Egyptian culture, the Irish culture, and the Celtic, and also the Tuatha De Danann, the mystery, all of them are connected because they're all connected by people. And people want to tell their story. People want to tell where they came from, who they're connected to, and that's why we're even today, oh, are you one of the O'Connors of, Barrestown? Or, oh, no, or you're one of the Barretts of wherever. It's because we're saying, I'm part of a clan, I'm part of this. And so we must be always asking questions about history, asking questions about, so when someone has a story, you say, wow, that's a great story. Where did that come from? How did you get to that point? Because the more we ask, the more we actually start to know, and we can put the things together ourselves.